I love synthwave, right? We're all huge synthwave fans here, but right, if I had one critique, I would say that sometimes a lot of the music can sound a little similar, a little too similar.
Mhm.
So yeah, so how do you go about creating a song that still sounds synthwavy, has those elements that you talked about, but still is unique, like you talked about? How do you? What are some guidelines maybe you'd give someone on how they can go
Mhm.
about finding their unique twist? What are some like you mentioned experimenting? What are some experiments someone can run? Is it just maybe
Mhm.
looking to other genres and pulling in elements from other genres, or do you have any guidance in that area?
I think part of it is maybe bringing in influence from some other genres. Another part of it is experimenting with the way that you're putting together certain elements. So let me see if I can discuss some of that. I just finished the first track of an EP that I'm working on, and it is I'm trying to combine synthwave and reggae, kind of like the reggae that the Police did back in the '80s, which is kind of pop rock
Hmm.
reggae. So I'm going for this very spacey reverb and open feel. Think of Walking on the Moon with uh, with classic drum machine samples and with these emulation synth, and kind of going for that vibe, right? So I just ended or finished the first track. I went and learned about creating bass lines for reggae, the drum sounds, the drum patterns. I programmed a lot of percussion, so I went on YouTube and looked up conga patterns for reggae or timbale patterns for reggae, and this was a very interesting experience. Ultimately, definitely, it's not synthwave for everyone and anyone. It has a very specific flavor. I think it does fit the mold. Um, I would say loosely of it being synthwave, but in any case, I learned a lot just by going out of my comfort zone, trying something different, learning new skills. Then when I bring all that back in and do something more mainstream, I'm sure some of that will percolate or will come through in the music. So it's making experiments like that. Or for example, a few months ago, I made a 3-track EP where the EP is called 118 AM, and the gist of that EP is that the 3 tracks are in the tempo of 118 BPM, and they're all in A minor. So by creating that limitation or that self-imposed restriction of all the 3 tracks being at 118 BPM and in A minor, I had to really think about how I could make the tracks sound different one from the other, still within a general context. In that experiment, I also found it super useful and satisfying because I had to really work hard to do something new, at least for me. And again, trying out stuff like that, which may not always pan out, but again, going out of your comfort zone, trying other things, then bringing them back more into the mainstream. That's one general idea. The other is being very choiceful and intentional about the things that you do. For example, when you make a track, think about the drums, like the drum patterns. If you make enough tracks, or if you think about it, um, every time that you make a track, how do you program the drums? Do you always do them the same? What is the philosophy or the intention that you're bringing to your drums? For example, do you like to keep your drums simple? Do you like a lot of fills or bring in certain complexity? Do you like something super simple? Right. So in time, if you make conscious choices about the way that you create your drum parts, as you make more music, as you build your body of work, someone will be able to tell, okay, I know this is an Alonso track because his drum parts are typically super simple, but at certain times they do this or do that, right? Or they're typically very tasteful and they do feel like a live drummer as opposed to a programmed drum machine. Okay, so that's one way. Or for example, um, thinking about melodies, it's very common or in synthwave what I to come into or to come into contact with what I call pseudo melodies, which aren't really melodies, more melodic elements where people just take an arpeggio and play just a couple of notes, and those aren't really melodies that go anywhere, that take you on a journey from beginning to end, right? So that's very hard to find in synthwave because people they don't make the effort of learning how to properly write a melody. But in any case, if on your tracks you make the effort to make every melodic element and every melody super solid, telling a story, or really going beyond just taking the core tones and creating something that sounds like a pseudo arpeggio, in time, if you do that many times, come up with great riffs and with great melodies, people would notice and they would say, "Oh, if there's a melody that I feel is taking me somewhere that really speaks, that has to be an Alonso song because I know his music and I know how he really likes to craft melodies that speak to me and that make me feel something." Maybe the same with some other production element. Maybe let's say like reverb or lack of reverb. Let's say I really like my arrangements to be super drenched and washed in reverb, but in a way that works. So every time you hear a track that has that super reverbed sound, that's, I don't know, whatever, you immediately say, okay, that it has to be this guy's track versus another, right? And it's those choices that we make every time that we produce a track over and over that will say that will point to us. It's the same as you think of an Adele song, right? What makes an Adele song an Adele song? Well, if you listen to a chorus, you say, "Oh, definitely that's Adele." And if it were something else, then it would be a different band or a different artist. But then it's the making the same choices with consciousness and intention over and over in your songwriting, in your production, that ultimately, as you build your body of work, those tiny details, some of those details are very big, some of them are small. The choices, maybe you only like to use one synth in your entire track, where you're using different patches, of course, for the bass and the lead or whatever, but you only use Juno and, let's say, Lynn. If all your tracks are Juno Lynn, that's something very particular that people could immediately recognize, right? And it's making those weird decisions that you stick to them. Think about Van Gogh, right? The way that he painted, how he used to paint. You see a painting and immediately you recognize Van Gogh versus some other guy. And it's the same, trying to look for those decisions, conscious choices, and that you make time and time again that ultimately will start to build or create your style and your flavor.
Okay. So I guess to summarize, so would you say so it's basically identify those key elements that you really love, that really you like, and that becomes kind of the core of your sound, and then one at a time identify different elements that you maybe want to experiment with?
Right, certainly. And it's definitely a path, a journey. And some of these choices, you don't make them consciously, and you can't make all of these choices while producing your first track, maybe not your 10th, right? It's when you're on the journey, when you create many tracks, one after the other with certain consistency, you start making those decisions like, oh, this last track, I really liked how the drums came out. So let me try that on my next track, right? Or really, I feel like the melody that I did on this other track sounded pretty cool. Let me try a similar approach to this track. So it's all done in movement, in motion, right? Like you can't steer a parked car. These things in training and in working your butt off to make music. It's not something that you sit down and figure out the destination before you get there. It's like, imagine going from the East Coast to the West Coast in the US and wanting to just follow a very just the same path with all the traffic lights being green. That's not going to happen, right? There are going to be detours and a lot of stuff that happens along the way, and the real growth and the challenges and all these decisions that make up your style. You find them while you're in motion, struggling in the trenches or battling it out, right, with the production process.
How do you kind of take it to the next level, or what are some techniques you use to make your synthwave stand out and actually sound unique versus kind of just like everything else?
Right. I think it's always a fine balance. So you have the sort of usual suspects, the 707, the Lindrum, the Fatline baseline preset, if you're using the Korg. And so, you can always start with that. But what I'm hearing, especially of late, is that guys are not really using that anymore. They're sort of like incorporating samples from different genres like progressive house, sometimes even hip hop. This is one reason why I really liked Trevor Something. I mean, it's not your typical synthwave album, but it is a synthwave album. And he's using things like an 808 and some interesting reverbs and some interesting chords and vocal effects with, I think he has an auto tune in there. So that was really interesting to hear that. he was doing that some 9 or 10 years ago. But as for beginners looking to get into it, I'd say learn the basics. And then once you have that in your wheelhouse, it will change things up. You know, you don't have to use a 707 or a Lindrum or, you know, one of these typical sounding instruments. You can always experiment. You can always figure out how to layer your sounds with maybe one of those instruments, but you can also add your own sort of touch by, you know, layering and using things from different genres, you know, like use a kick drum from a deep house sample pack, use an 808, you know, maybe not always rely on gated reverbs for your snare, you know, or maybe layer your snare with something else, another percussive instrument from, I don't know, an Afrobeat sample pack, you know, make it yours, make it stand out from what everyone else is doing. And I think some guys are doing some really great things, but I think there's room for expansion. I think there's room to sort of transform the sound and add to it and make it sound a little more creative than the typical, you know, I mean, it gets a little like,
it does get a little repetitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, some fantastic artists out there doing exactly that. They're sort of keeping it synthwave, but they're finding creative ways of making it their own.
All right, that kind of makes me think of the album Monsters by the Midnight, is they added a lot of more modern production. They used kind of like more like trap style drums, and they had the modern vocal chops and stuff. And I thought that was really cool. It's definitely still synthwave. You hear it, that's synthwave, but it's very different. It stands out. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
Be sure to download my free synthwave sample pack in the description. Not only does this contain over 100 80s drum and effects samples, but it also includes my Synthwave sound design cookbook, which includes step-by-step recipes for creating your own synthwave sounds, and it includes my Synthwave mixing cheat sheet, which breaks down specific mixing techniques you can use to get that retro synthwave sound every single time. Again, this is all free in the description below, or you can go to orpheusaudioacademy.com/starter pack. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that like button like you're Marty McFly trying to get back to the future. And if you want more help creating synthwave music, be sure to click the video playing on the screen right now, as that is my full in-depth tutorial on creating a synthwave song from start to finish. With that, have an awesome day and keep creating.